Hello, my name's Julia Payne. I'm Director of The Hub. I really hope you enjoy this second in our Balance series of talks, all designed to help creative freelancers and entrepreneurs balance their minds as well as their books. You join us just as I introduce my co-host for the session, Andy Gibson from Mindapples.
Hello.
Hello. And Andy is founder and head gardener of Mindapples, which is a brilliant mental health charity. I definitely recommend that you check it out. Andy, could you just tell us a little bit about Mindapples to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So welcome back to those who were at the previous session, but for anyone who's joining us fresh, then I suppose the best way to sum up Mindapples is that we're a public mental health organisation, so we're interested in helping everyone to take better care of their minds, and particularly our focus is on public education and getting people to share tips and insights and reflecting on what our minds need and how we can get things to support and protect our well-being, both individually and collectively. So a lot of our charitable work at the moment is with schools and university project that we're kicking off, and various attempts to try and work with groups of people who are being affected through the lockdown. And so it's really nice to be back and to do more of these sessions with them.
Yeah. Great. It's lovely to be working with Andy again. We met years and years ago on a project, on an event that I was running, and so it's great to be working with Andy on this one.
Yes, a happiness conference it was.
It was.
In
Happiness is a serious business.
Yes, in which you briefed me to be the anti-happiness person on the opening panel.
I did. That's right. Yes. Yeah.
Which I said was a bit like punching a panda. No one's going to thank you for doing it.
So just a little bit about this series. This is the second in 4 talks that we're doing, the Balance series. And originally this started out, way back in the start of the year as a training series that we were going to do for people that are based locally. I'm based in Essex. And then when the pandemic hit and lockdown, and we went into lockdown, the funders of this project, so South East Creatives and Colchester Borough Council, were really generous, and they said, no, take the money and put it all online and let people from around the country join in. So we have to say a big thank you to them for continuing to support us. Just a little bit of housekeeping about today, and then we'll get into the real chat. We're going to be talking today about how to cope when uncertainty feels like the only certainty. So we're going to be covering things like anxiety and stress and overwhelm, and hopefully arming you with loads of useful tips and insights. One of the things I wanted to say is that we do want to work the chat really hard, because one of the values, I suppose, that underpins the Hub is this idea of curiosity and generosity. We talk about those 2 things a lot at the Hub. And I have a real sense that we would all be a lot smarter if we shared what we know. So if you are happy to use the chat to sort of share your thoughts as you're going along, if you have any questions that you want us to pick up at the end, or if you've just got any tips or inspiration, we're going to be asking you to share those in the chat along the way, so that we can kind of crowdsource, if you like, a sort of manifesto or a whole range of top tips that we can then share back with you when we email you with the link to the video after today's session. A little bit about the format. Andy and I are going to chat probably for about half an hour or so. If you've got questions that you would like to ask us while we're talking, just pop those in the chat and we will come back to those. We'll have a little bit of a Q&A session before we finish. I just want to introduce a couple of people very quickly before we do that. If I can ask Abby, Sarah and Matt to just unmute themselves and give people a wave. You might need to sort of scroll along your screen. So Abby, first of all, if you could say hello.
Hi everyone.
Abby is the community manager at the Creative Industries Federation, who are brilliant partners on this project for us, and we're really pleased to be working with them. If you're not a member of the Creative Industries Federation, I do really, really strongly urge you to join. They're a fantastic organisation doing really good work. Abby is going to be looking after the chat today, so thanks, Abby, for that. Sarah Singleton, would you like to give us a wave?
Hello, morning.
Hi. So Sarah is a friend of mine, and she is going to be doing a graphic illustration of today's conversation. And I don't know if any of you saw the first talk that we did, but she did a really lovely one for that. So we're going to come back to Sarah at the end, and she's going to share her screen and show us her work in progress. But they're really lovely things, and I think if you're looking for a way to sort of stay in touch and remember some of the things that came up today, then having one of Sarah's drawings pinned to your wall is probably a really good way to go. And then Matt is somewhere on the call as well. Matt is looking after all the tech, so just wanted to say thanks to Matt as well. Great. Okay. So I think what we should do is probably get into the meat of the conversation, if that sounds all right. We'll kick things off properly. So we're here to talk about uncertainty, and I think one of the things when we were planning this session, we were thinking was that uncertainty is the only certainty at the moment. I'm aware that I sound like some kind of crazy politician in saying that. And so making friends with uncertainty feels like a really smart thing to do at the moment. And someone I was talking to the other day was, he described his mind as the venue of his life, which I thought was a really interesting. He was saying everything that happens, whether it's me center stage or me watching, it's all happening in my mind, and my mind is the venue of my life. I thought it was a really lovely image. And it made me think about how, certainly for the first time ever in my lifetime, that people everywhere around the world, there's never been a time when it's more important for us all to care for our minds. It's obviously for individuals, for some of us, sometimes it's more important than others, but collectively, this feels like a real moment. And there's so much uncertainty and a sort of unpredictability that it feels to me like we really need to invest the time and the energy into protecting our minds. And I think at the moment, I don't know if this is true for everybody, but at the moment, I kind of feel like there's a bit of a sort of disconnect between people for whom life is kind of going back to normal because shops are reopening and bars are opening and things like that. And lots of the things that they can do, that they want to do, they can do. But it seems like there are lots of us probably on this call for whom that normality feels like a really long way off. Like we're talking about like March next year before some of us will be able to get back into our venues and do what we normally do, that sort of thing. And it feels like it's a little bit of a jarring. And I don't know, sometimes I think, I feel a bit like we've been forgotten. Or, we're sort of, we're not in the same situation as everybody else. So with that in mind, Andy, I wanted to just to kick something off. So we're here to talk partly about, to talk about uncertainty. And when we talked last time, you did a really brilliant sort of brain sciencey thing at the beginning where you talked about what's going on in our minds, and you talked about how our minds are our friends and they're doing our best for us. And I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about what's going on with our minds, with all this uncertainty, what's happening for our minds.
Yes, I'll do some science at you.
Do some science.
We need some science. We follow it. I like that. I like the idea of the mind as a venue, but it's partly because I suppose the public presentation of what the audience will get at a venue is of everything being wonderfully put together. But of course, backstage, there is all this panicking and running around and, oh my God, we've lost the costumes and something's fallen down. And so I think actually, I relate to that idea of my mind as a venue, because there's the front stage and then there's the backstage as well. And so that's partly what we're trying to talk a bit about. I suppose that, it's been a strange time, obviously, for everyone, but it does feel like the creative sector we're having to sort of drag support out a bit from government, and it's still feeling very uncertain what the plan is, and everyone's individually trying to make plans. And I think there's an old saying in boxing that's often attributed to Mike Tyson, but is before that was attributed to Joe Louis. It gets attributed to whoever's the key boxer of the age, but it's that saying, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And it's the planning that we've been doing. It's not just that we've got we've got uncertainty now. It's that we had plans before, and now those things have stopped. And so it's partly the dealing with that disconnection between our expectations of the year and what's actually playing out. And then there's the actual replanning process of what is it we're going to do next. How do we get a grip on it? And I know we're going to talk in the next session a bit more about strategy and trying to identify what we've got energy for and what we've got capability for. So, but before we do that, we need to get a bit of a grip on what's going on in our minds in faced with all this. It's not to say that uncertainty is inevitably bad for us. It is certainly possible to approach uncertainty with a mindset of feeling that it's an opportunity, that it's interesting, that it's a chance to learn. It's about a lot of it's whether you feel that the things that you need or the things that you care about are being threatened or taken away. So it's more that feeling of threat that's the problem than just generally uncertainty. Because if you feel that the things that you care about are protected and secure, then uncertainty can be approached as this might be an interesting surprise, or the kind of adventure of it. And And that's part of the creative process, the uncertainty. That is, it's an area which, in theory, embraces that. And I'm often quoting Keith Johnston, the wrote Impro and various other great books on improv theatre. And he said there's a world of yes and a world of no. One leads to one leads to excitement, the other leads to danger, I think it is. But it's this idea of, are we in a world of yes or a world of no at the moment? It feels like it's all no. Everything's danger, everything's threats, everything's a problem. And all the chances to try and explore and do something interesting feel far away. In terms of brain science, though, I suppose a lot of this is about where we put our attention, because we don't have huge control over things, even at the best of times. It's an illusion a lot of the time. So the question is more about where are you placing your attention? Where are you trying to make progress? Where are your plans attached to? What attachments do you have to where you want things to go? And what else can you let go and just trust and see how it evolves? So I think the key thing is to try and figure out where is your focus and which bits do you feel you need to have under control in order to make the rest of the uncertainty more tolerable, rather than thinking we need to control everything, because we'd be exhausted. It would be very tiring to be in control of everything. So yeah, I think a lot of it, think of it as attention management and threat management, and we'll maybe talk a bit about the threat stuff particularly as we go through.
Yeah, I wanted to come back on that. So but before I do that, because the two are linked, I'm going to talk about the fact that we have 60,000 thoughts a day. I'm going to come back to that in a second. But with that in mind, one of the things that I didn't remember to tell you or ask you before we kicked off was if I could ask you to switch off your cameras while we're doing the chat, just so that, and then you can watch me and Andy in gallery view, and then we'll be really big and fabulous, and it would be really lovely for you. Sorry, so many thoughts go around in my mind that I totally forgot to voice that one. So I read somewhere the other day that somebody said that it was 60,000 thoughts a day, and somebody else said it was like 75,000 thoughts a day, and it made me think, I suppose, that what you've got to do is you've got to think about which ones you're going to focus on, because lots of anxiety is based on the negative thoughts that you give yourself. So that sort of makes sense. You're focusing on which thoughts to think about.
Yeah, the way that we often talk about it in the Mindapples training and the way that we write about it is that there's too much information coming at you to process it all consciously, and so the amount of stuff that we have coming at us, we can't give each part of it our deliberate conscious attention and decide whether or not it's worth thinking about. On an unconscious level, your mind is knocking a bunch of stuff out and saying, that doesn't matter, this is the important thing. And that filtering process is very influenced by your emotional state. And so if it's not to say that there's anything wrong with negative emotions or positive emotions, they're both useful in different ways, but they play different roles in focusing and filtering our attention. So negative moods and emotions focus your mind on threats and problems and things that you need to change or deal with, which is very useful. We don't want to lose that capability, but positive emotions will broaden your focus out and help you notice possibilities, opportunities, things to explore. And so which mood you're in will affect the types of things that get your attention and the things that you notice. And so one of the key things to think about when you're faced with threats or uncertainty or problems is what are you missing? Are there aspects of this that have become, you've got blind spots that have evolved because you're just ending up thinking about this thing that you're worried about, and so because of that you miss these other things that might be actually helpful in that. And so it's not about saying we've got to all be positive and perky, it's about trying to avoid bias to make sure that we're getting the broadest view of the situation as possible and not missing things, either negatively or positively.
Yeah, there's this thing, the Chinese symbol for crisis apparently is the symbol for danger and the symbol for opportunity welded together, which I thought was, when I found that, I was like, that makes so much sense, because it's you can respond to a sort of crisis and think, wow, this is an opportunity, there's something quite exciting about this, or you can be overwhelmed by it. So I loved the fact that there was a symbol that sort of summed that up. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about a couple of emotions actually that I know from my own experience kind of can be the opposite of calm, and sort of for me are tied up with this feeling of uncertainty. And the first of those is anxiety. So what can you tell us a little bit about what anxiety actually is and what the consequences are in terms of our ability to cope with uncertainty?
Yes, and to do that, I think I need to give you a little bit more theoretical background to it. Just one of the most important concepts in all of the things that we talk about at Mindapples is the distinction between a mood and an emotion. And the we use the words quite interchangeably, and often we're not quite clear how to define the difference between them. But the kind of best functional definition that I've found for all this is that essentially moods are like background emotions. A lot of people talk about them as a sort of emotional body temperature, like a persistent background state. So we use the word in a very similar way, actually. At any point, we all have some kind of temperature that our body is at. But if you say, I've got a temperature, it means there's something wrong with your temperature. And similarly, you all have some kind of mood that you're in at any moment. But if you say, I'm in a mood, it means there's something wrong with your mood. And the distinction between moods and emotions is emotions are quite short-term and reactive to things, and they come and go more quickly. Moods persist for longer and are less related to what's actually going on. So you might have a sequence of things that make you feel scared, but then you sort of shrug them off and you feel fine the next day, and it hasn't affected your long-term mood state. Whereas you might also have a sequence of things that make you feel scared, and then even after those things have gone, you still feel on edge because it's no longer about the things. It's become about you. It's become about what you've internalized from it. So we talk a lot about managing moods because you can't necessarily do anything about the day-to-day emotional reactions you have to all the different things that happen. You'd go crazy trying to lock down every emotion that you experience. But what you can notice is, what am I taking on from that, and what's lingered with me, and what's getting in the way of me actually experiencing the next thing clearly for what it is, because I'm still holding on to the feelings from yesterday or last week. And anxiety is best understood in that sense. There's nothing wrong with being afraid. The anxiety is when you start feeling afraid when actually things are safe, and it's no longer, you can't fix it by shifting the world or making things safer, because actually you have to fix it by looking at your mind and shifting your mood.
And so to some extent, anxiety is kind of normal, isn't it? It's a way of coping with situations that are stressful and dangerous. But I suppose the problem, like you were saying, the problem is when it becomes persistent and it lasts for a longer sort of length of time. What can we do to sort of pattern interrupt the kind of the thinking or the kind of chain reaction that goes on when we feel anxious over a longer period of time?
Yeah, it's one of the key things in cognitive behavioral therapies, and people like Albert Ellis has written a lot on this, is to understand the connection between how you think and how you feel. So what you were talking about, kind of loops of thoughts, that a lot of this it's not the only reason that we experience emotions. Things that you do, the situations that you find yourself in, everything has an impact. The bit that's most in your control is the part where you can identify when your thoughts are prompting further anxious emotions. So you can't necessarily change the world around you, but you can change your mind. You can try and make sure that your inner world at least feels like a place where people are nice to you and things are safe, even if the world around you can't guarantee that. So a lot of cognitive therapies are focusing on habits of mind, where if you think that something bad is going to happen, what's the thought that you then follows on from that, the beliefs that you construct around it, your explanatory framework for dealing with things. And there was one of the things that we're looking into reactions to COVID and the psychology of that and the anxiety that's been happening. There was a big peak in anxiety early on at the start of lockdown, and then it's been fading away as people sort of adjust to the new normal. But then different sectors, there'll be different spikes of uncertainty and anxiety as we go through with it. But one of the things that they looked at with the swine flu pandemic, when people were very anxious about that in the early days of it, is to look at what protective factors would help. And one of the things is how you respond to ambiguous circumstances. So if you're just looking at one key question to think about your thought processes, is when you don't know if something is safe or not, do you assume it's a threat or assume it's okay? And people who assume that, if they don't know if something's safe, it's probably fine, tend to be a lot less anxious. Whereas if your default mode is, oh, this might be a threat, I better be careful just in case, then you'll likely end up with more of those anxious thoughts. So it's a lot of it's to do with your guesswork, your assumptions about the world, rather than, of course, if there is something frightening or threatening, it's perfectly rational to get frightened and to deal with it.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been experimenting with a little bit is something that I came across a few weeks ago called the 5-4-3-2-1 exercise. I don't know if you know that. So it's a way of sort of coping with anxiety. So when you're feeling anxious, it's to do with the senses. So it's you have to find five things that you can see, 4 things that you can feel, 3 things that you can hear, two things that you are going to run out of senses, but two things that you can smell, and then one that you can taste. And I think the idea is that by the time you've done that, you've kind of distracted yourself, or you've grounded yourself. And I found that's been really, really, really useful. It's quite an interesting one to do. But somebody told me the other day as well that, so visualizations, people will often say, if you're feeling anxious, try and visualize your favorite sort of happy place. And they said, and I don't know if this is true, but they said that your brain can't distinguish between the visualization of, say, the beach that you really love and actually being on the beach. I don't know if that's true, but it's
an extreme way to state it, but I know what you mean. Yeah, it's a sort of the same is true with computer games, actually. Computer games, more than any other medium, seems to be something where the brain absorbs itself into it as if it's there. So which presents lots of opportunities for learning and education, for example, because you can actually step people through experiences like in simulators for flying. But yeah, I think a lot of this, I suppose, is about trying to think about your inner world. It's one of the reasons I call myself a head gardener, is that my mind needs weeding. I want to make it a nice garden up there rather than a sort of blasted wasteland full of trash. And so trying to think about what you want in your world, not just the outer one but the inner one as well, it's not a kind of exact science about what works for you. It's more about trying to find a place that feels like home for you. But the technique you're talking about is grounding. They are the kind of going through the different steps of it. Another thing that's also quite interesting is labeling, which is where you just take a moment to identify what emotion you're experiencing or how you feel and give it a name. So if you're feeling that you're criticizing yourself a lot, just go, I notice I'm doing some criticizing. And if you're feeling very scared, you go, I'm feeling very scared right now. Just the process of naming it can often lessen some of the intensity because it gives it a little bit of distance. It's no longer a thing that you're in. It's a thing that you're observing, that you are slightly outside of it. So a lot of it's about that presence in the moment, but also it's about distance and reflection and being able to observe yourself.
Yeah, I mean, Tracy has anticipated me. She's just popped into the chat that walking is a way that she deals with anxiety. It'd be great to if people could share some tips. If you've got anything that you do that helps you kind of deal with that spiral of anxiety, please do share those in the chat. It'd be brilliant, and then we can kind of add them all together and share them back out with everybody when we do the follow-up blog. I mean, we talked last time about a few things, the idea of like a kitchen disco, because the idea of the energy, changing the energy, that sort of thing was one. And then I heard one the other day where somebody said when they're feeling anxious, they put an ice cube in their hand and then they just have to focus on it until it's melted. And so I'm sure that we'll get some really nice ones in the chat that we can maybe come back to a little bit later. So I'm interested in talking a little bit about stress as well, because so anxiety is about fear and about sometimes it's about feeling out of control and not having the resources to, not feeling equipped to cope with something. But it's a sort of general fear, isn't it? So it's often not got a very strong focus. It's I just feel anxious about everything, So I think it can generate a sense of overwhelm. So I think it's like a second cousin or something to stress. It's very similar to stress, but stress is a bit different, I think, isn't it? So it'd be great to just hear a little bit more about stress.
Yes, perhaps a sort of artistic collaboration between anxiety and stress. They work on some projects together sometimes, but they've all got their own work, it's sort of, I suppose that a lot of people end up using the words in all kinds of different ways. So, I mean, people, if someone says they're stressed, you're never quite sure what they mean, because sometimes what someone means is that they, say, I'm so stressed at the moment, and they mean they've just had a bunch of people be rude to them and they're annoyed, and someone else might say, oh, it's good to be stressed, gets you out of bed in the morning, keeps you going, because they've confused stress with excitement, which is different. And then someone else is thinking, I haven't slept for 2 weeks and I feel like crying all the time. Is that good? Am I supposed to feel a bit like that? And so we often miss each other. So a lot of what we do, particularly in our corporate work, is trying to give everyone a working definition of stress. And we define stress as really the relationship between you and the situation that you're in. So it's not anything wrong with you, nor is it necessarily that situation is stressful for everyone, but how you are in that situation that you perceive as taxing or exceeding your resources and endangering your well-being. And the key word is danger. That actually stress is a fear response, same as anxiety, but it's got a particular role, which is to respond urgently to threats. Whereas anxiety is more about vigilance. It's more about trying to keep your mind alert in case there's a threat. Stress is if there is actually a threat, this is how your mind will kick in. And so it's very useful for the sort of primal threats that we would have evolved to deal with. So it's very useful if you're being attacked by a tiger. Great to get stressed. I really recommend it because it gets you into this heightened state. You want to fight the tiger or run away from the tiger. But it's very, very difficult to do complex things. So if you're trying to write a funding proposal, when all you want to do is punch your laptop or run away, then it's not the best mindset to be able to write a funding proposal. So a lot of the problems we have with stress are because it's not really evolved for our modern environment, and the threats that we're facing, particularly, I mean, a pandemic is a classic example of a threat that can't be fought or run from in the way that other things can. We need our cognitive abilities. We need to think in order to be safe. And there's lots of different replanning around how we need to adapt. So it's the worst thing to be in that primal state where you can't think straight. But that your mind's just trying to help. As I said last time, your mind is your friend. It thinks that there's a threat. It wants you to keep safe. So it's giving you lots of adrenaline, but it means you can't sleep. It means that you're not necessarily going to remember everything that you wanted to do. You'll miss stuff. So
yeah, I mean, that's interesting. So I'm really bad at, I don't know if this means that I'm super stressed, but I'm really bad at remembering things. So what I have to do is I have to, anyone that works for me knows that I come up with all these little sort of acronyms to help me remember things. And so it's interesting you talked about it being a danger response, because my stress one is SOS, which is like, stand back. So this, I think, picks up on what you were talking about earlier, kind of observe. And so like you were saying, labeling, notice what you're feeling and recognize that you're feeling it, and then try and steer yourself in the right direction. And so SOS, so it's like, okay, what do I need? SOS. It's kind of, that's in my mind. And sometimes that steering it can be about just moving to a different room and just thinking differently and just trying to interrupt, I think. So that's quite good for me. But the other thing that I've found when we first went into lockdown was just thinking, I stuck this up all around the house to try and help me sort of think about it, was just asking the question, how would I like it to be? And I found that really, really helpful, because it sort of shifted that energy away from thinking about all the bad stuff to thinking more positively about where I could go. I found that quite helpful.
It's one of the reasons gratitude journals are quite helpful for these things, because a lot of these things that I think if you just take it at its face value, a lot of these things can sound like they're just about trying to be optimistic or perky, or to try and pretend everything's fine when it's not, which I don't know, it never rings very true with me. But the way to think of it is it's a rebalancing of trying to avoid bias. So if your mind is spending 23 and a half hours a day looking at all of the possible threats, then maybe spend half an hour thinking about some of the good things as well, because otherwise you're never going to see the full picture.
Yeah. I mean, I was interested in one of the things that you talked about before with stress, about this idea that it narrows your focus. So, I was talking about this just yesterday with somebody where, normally your focus would be this broad and you'd be thinking, oh, how can I get all these people to help me? Or whatever. But then when you're stressed and in the moment, your focus narrows to like that. And you talk quite a lot about the fact that that means that we miss things. And I found that really helpful to think about the idea that you miss things when you're in that immediate kind of stress response. Could you just talk a little bit more about what that is?
Yeah. So a lot of it, so partly it may be that you miss information, and so your mind is focusing on threats. You may miss out on some other things that are actually quite helpful in the situation. So partly it can lead to misdiagnosing a situation, misunderstanding what's happening. A good example from a few years ago is when I was I did a book talk, and I was my previous book, Mind for Business, and I was fairly new to it. I was quite nervous about the whole thing, and I wanted them to be able to sell the book, and it didn't seem like the venue was going to do it. So I ended up carrying 30 copies of the book over so that we could sell it, and I had to take them on the tube, and then because I couldn't carry them, I got a cab, and I got stuck in traffic, so I arrived really late, and I was really stressed by it. And then there was a bookstall there because of course they were selling the book, and I'd misread the email, and so I'd created this whole extra load of work because I wasn't paying sufficient attention to the information, and I'd ended up thinking there was a threat which actually wasn't there at all. And the biggest looping effect that you can get to with this is that it also makes you forget your resources. So a big thing that we talk about when we talk to people in our corporate sessions about handling pressure, is that what your mind does whenever you're faced with a potentially stressful situation is you will undertake a cognitive appraisal, and your mind will ask itself one key question, which is, do I have the resources to deal with this? If you don't feel you have the resources, then it feels like a threat and you get stressed. If you do, it feels like a challenge or an opportunity, and then you can try and get motivated to do it. So a lot of these things are where we are on the line of, do I feel overwhelmed by this, or do I feel like it's a manageable challenge? And when you're stressed, you forget your resources. So things can feel more impossible because you forget who you know, you forget what you can do, you forget things that you have that might help you. So I had a project for a client a few years ago where I was really stressed by it. I felt out of my depth. It was important that I did it right, and I didn't feel like I had the skills to, and I just about stumbled over the line, but it was very unpleasant couple of weeks. And then about 3 days later, after I'd calmed down, I was like, why didn't I call my friend Alex about that? He does this for a living. He owes me a favor. He could have sorted the whole thing out in a day. And I just literally forgot he existed, and I made that a lot more difficult than it needed to be. So that's the key thing when you're stressed, is to try and consciously remind yourself of what you have, the people that can help you, the assets at your disposal, all the times that you've done things in the past. All of those things can help to suddenly make you think, oh yeah, actually, no, maybe I am up for this. Maybe this is all right.
Yeah. I mean, that point about resources, I think is really interesting, isn't it? Because, I think it feels like we're straying sort of into resilience, which I think often, in my mind is kind of resourcefulness. I think resilience is one of those words. We've got loads of them in the arts sector, where words get overused to the point where they mean like a zillion things to a zillion different people. But so I guess resilience is that ability to kind of learn from and bounce back. And I always think of it as a sort of, I can't draw this, but kind of a smile, like you're here at the beginning, and then you do that, and then you come back. And I quite like the idea that that's a smiley head smiley face in my head. But I mean, just thinking about that resilience thing, I know that you talk about sort of two different types of people. So you talk about I always latch onto labels because it's the only way I can kind of remember things. But so I know you talk about people being either worriers or warriors. So I wonder, is resilience something that you just have, or can you work on it? What can we become more resilient, or are we just stuck with what we were given?
I'll put it into a bit of context. So this is from the Mind Manual. It's because you've been reading the book, you see.
Yeah, I've got it here, look.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Yes. Oh, excellent. Very good.
I'll do a link to it later, don't worry.
Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, the first chapter of that, I wanted to go into more detail on the big 5 personality traits to sort of set up the rest of the book to understand that people are different in their reactions. So it's not so much that there's 2 types of people. It's one of the factors that can influence our personality is sensitivity. In technical terms, they call it neuroticism, but it means how sensitive are you to negative emotions and experiences. And so the worrier or warrior thing is more about whether you are naturally very affected by things that go wrong, whether you take criticism hard, whether you need to manage your moods a lot, or whether you tend to shrug things off and just feel less affected by them. And there's been a bit of back and forth about how you relate the concept of resilience to that, because you may have friends who they just see bad stuff happens and they seem fine, and you're not quite sure how they're fine, and you wonder if they're lying, but actually they genuinely seem to be fine. And then you may know other people who small things happen and it really affects them and they're upset for a long time. And so is that resilience? I don't know. Resilience often, I think, is talked about more as coping skills. So it may be that actually people who've got a higher sensitivity have learned more skills in order to manage it. And actually, when somebody who's a bit more used to just shrugging things off gets something that they can't shrug off, they have no tools. And so they need support from other people who've had to learn more ways of managing themselves. So it depends a bit on the circumstances. The way that I think about resilience, I suppose, I like that idea of resourcefulness. I think I prefer that. Resilience can sound a bit like we've got to toughen up or numb out or feel less, which I don't think is a good aspiration for life, but particularly not in the kind of work that we're talking about, in a way it's all about trying to feel something, to be connected to what's going on in your inner world and in the world around you. But I think generally it's talked about as, are you good at maintaining your well-being in the face of all the things coming at you? So can you build that protection between the inner world and the outer world? and it should assist you to be able to respond effectively. But the key really is, do you have a capacity to respond? Can you respond in a way that's constructive, that helps to make situations better, that protects you from what's going on around you? Or do you feel a bit lost, a bit stuck for how to respond, and sort of at the mercy of things? But it's not to say that there's a kind of, there's a perfect way of being where you're perfectly resilient. If you look at the lists of all the things that make people resilient, it's things like analytic ability, social skills, confidence in yourself, clear strategy and vision, like emotional self-management. So it just reads like a list of being a wonderful person. So resilient people are tremendously irritating, and it just seems like they get everything right.
So it's like you're reading my mind. I was thinking, yeah, if I met someone like that, I'd be sort of a bit jealous, but also a bit like, It's interesting that the idea about coping. So I did a course ages ago now on, it was called Boosting Resilience, and it was a sort of a leadership, it was a cultural leadership sort of program. And on that course, they talked about skillful coping. And I thought that was so interesting. It was like a real kind of like moment for me, because up until then, I'd always thought my ability to cope was like, a bit like you were saying, I just got away with that, almost like you were kind of like cheating the system. And then the moment somebody said it was a skill, I was like, check me out. I'm a skillful coper. And it really changed my thinking about, how I cope and the way that I thought about my ability to do it. I thought it was really interesting. I suppose I like to think of resilience as like a kind of muscle that you can train, maybe, if you work on it, and if you're more aware of, what's involved in being resilient, then you can kind of develop those skills, or break or develop new habits. Does that ring true with you?
Yes, I think the bit that needs to be also added into it, though, is that I think a lot of resilience discussions focus on the skills, because those are the bits that you as an individual might be able to learn, on a training course or whatever. So there's certainly skills involved. I'd say a lot of it on the skills side, I think of it as self-knowledge and awareness. So understanding what affects you, how it affects you, the things that help you, and understanding the connection between what you do and how you feel. A lot of what we're doing in our training is helping people to understand and know themselves better. And that's really the sort of core skill with it. But resilience isn't purely about your own skills, because it's also about the support that you get, the assets that you have. It's all of your resources. So the bit that we can end up missing in it is that it can often be focused on the individual, as that the individual's job is to be able to be skillful in dealing with everything that comes at them. But actually, one way to be more resilient is to have £1 million in the bank. And don't let the people with £1 million in the bank pretend that they are somehow more skilled at coping than the rest of us. They're not. They just have more resources. And so whether that's your social support network, or people that care about you, or the skills that you're falling back on in your work, or a confidence in yourself, lots of different things can be deployed to help you feel like things are manageable.
Yeah, I'm going to come on to that actually, because I want to talk a little about resilient businesses, because I've been running a training course where we talked about that. But it'd be really useful. I think one of the things is that I often think about is that we're much more resourceful than we give ourselves credit for. Probably because a lot of the time when we think about this stuff, we're stressed, and you're in that, I don't know how to do this, I can't cope, da 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 da. But I think it'd be great if people could think about a sort of a stressful situation in their own lives, and the resources and the assets that they maybe brought to that, and and how they got through it. It'd be really great if people are up for sharing something like that in the chat. It'd be great to see some sort of ideas around that. But just picking up on that thing about resilient businesses, because I do a lot of the work that I do is working with freelancers or small businesses, helping them to I guess build stronger businesses or stronger careers, and there's a sort of octagon that I often get people to talk through, which I can share in the blog afterwards. But so a bit like you were saying, so some of those resources and assets that you have, so from a sort of business point of view, it would be like financial assets, so the cash that you've got, the reserves that you've got, any investments, that sort of thing. But built assets as well, so buildings that you've got, or equipment or facilities, it's almost like a little sort of stock check. But I know we're going to talk about motivation next time, but sort of like your vision and your mission that you have, and the values. I think those are really, really important when you're in this kind of kind of sea of uncertainty, where 1 minute you feel like you've got to tip that way, and another minute you think you've got to go there. But having those vision and values, it feels like a sort of anchor. So those feel like really important resources that you might forget, because they fall under that category of like in plain sight, and you forget them. but like you were saying as well, social assets. So people who could help you. You know, I'm doing a fair amount of sort of trading with people at the moment where I help them do that, and they give me something else in return, and I've got a bit of that going on. And then like your knowledge and your skills. Somebody in a session I was doing the other day said, and also your health. Your health is an asset and a resource, and I hadn't really thought about it in that. And then sort of like the power and influence, so the ability that you have to kind of shift, you know, the political, I guess, with a small piece. There are I've missed a few out there, but there are a whole series of assets that if you can do that kind of SOS thing and step back and observe and think about them, that you can remind yourself, like you say, that you can get through stuff. There's an image, isn't there, that people talk about resilience. They often talk about, you know, they have this image of the tree, and there's this idea that there's this sturdy kind of oak tree that's really stout and, you know, strong. And then you've got maybe a willow tree that's maybe a bit more sort of bendy, and actually it's the willow tree that's going to stay standing up long after the oak has probably tipped over, which I think is quite interesting. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, I don't know whether this is, you know, being talked about in the sort of chattering classes, but this idea of like the difference between bouncing back and bouncing forward, and this idea of, you know, it's not just enough to cope. So bouncing back might be about like, oh, I've survived that, but actually the bouncing forward thing would be that I'm thriving and I've come back better and stronger. Do you have a view on, you know, on that?
Oh, loads to take in there. Hang on, I'm trying. So the bouncing back, bouncing forward thing. I mean, I suppose one of the things that was coming to mind when you were talking about the vision and strategy and things, which we can talk about next time in more detail, is that it can be a blessing and a curse depending on how you use it. So one of the things that makes a business more resilient is its willingness to do anything to get money. And so if you're in a position now where you're like, well, I used to sell catering equipment, but now I'm going to sell N95 masks, then you can flip your business and maybe do it. So I had a friend who runs a distillery over in the US, and he's just flipped to selling hand sanitizer, and so it's taken a huge amount of investment. They're not making loads of money, but at least it's kept the business going. So the question a lot of the time for creative industries is what would you consider in scope for still being part of your work that you would consider doing? You don't just want to go off and do something completely different, and that mission creep that comes in with funding and all the rest of it, all the things that we've all talked about a lot over the years. That so what you need to do is think creatively about what you stand for, how to deploy your values, how your practice can be advanced, to try and give yourself a lot of different options and routes to things that you still think you have soul, have purpose, have value to it. And the bouncing forward, you know, or kind of coming back stronger, you know, thriving rather than surviving, it would be, I suppose, if you felt like you weren't just balancing the books, but actually able to deliver your mission in a more effective way. That would be that's what you're looking for with all this. I mean, it's a big question for us about whether online training is better than face-to-face. We've always preferred doing face-to-face training, but a lot of our clients, we would be doing small group sessions face-to-face, and now we do a webinar, we get 140 people on. And is that more impact? Is that actually extending our charitable reach and helping more people? It may well be that the shifts in the way that we're learning give us an opportunity to work with hundreds of thousands of people instead of just thousands. So that's the thing to look for, I think, is there something that you can do to advance your mission, do something a bit better. I want to talk a bit about resilient businesses, though, because I don't know if do you want to...
No, carry on.
Sure. Just because we said we wanted to talk about this, that there's the economic side of it. I suppose there has been a shift in business strategy and in management theory from efficiency to resilience over the last few months, because the last decade, particularly since 2008, really, there's been a drive for efficiency, which means if there is wasted cash, if there are assets sitting in a warehouse somewhere that aren't being used, you sell them, you get rid of it, you extract it. And with charitable funding, a lot of that has been about the kind of shaving away of overheads and trying to run everything at the minimum costs possible. And of course what that does is it means if you get an unexpected thing go wrong, you have no resources to be able to cope with it. So everything's running at capacity. And so now it's becoming much more part of good management to make sure you have reserves, that you have a bunch of PPE in a warehouse somewhere if you need it, that you have a bit of room in your business for people to handle unexpected things, which most arts organizations haven't been allowed that luxury for a long time. So that, I think, is something I'd hope might grow from this, is the realization that, for example, you can't take it for granted that a venue is an asset. It might suddenly turn out to be a whole load of costs because you can't open it. And so all of those organisations that the Arts Council treated as being very resilient because they had an asset base from that, suddenly they're realising they need contingency plans. So that's what I hope might grow out of it, as an approach to resilience as a core activity for responsible leadership of arts and charities.
Yeah. It's interesting. Amy's just sharing in the chat there, will this, the 5-5-5 thing, will this matter in 5 minutes or 5 hours, 5 days? That's really one that interesting. I just wanted to talk a little bit about growth mindsets, because we said we would cover these as well. So I guess that's linked to what we were talking about, maybe even way back at the beginning, about this idea of danger, it's either danger or an opportunity. Could you talk a little bit more about those, the kind of growth mindset and what that means, and if there's anything we can do to shift our mindset from a kind of more fixed one to the kind of growth mindset?
Yeah, it's another one of these there are two types of people kind of theories, which one of the big questions has been, is there a mindset for resilience? Is there a way of thinking that you could train in people that would help them to cope better in difficult circumstances? Which seems like a very good idea if we could do it, but it's not quite clear whether what people are looking at is personality traits and kind of the natural capabilities and sensitivities in people's minds versus actually taught skills or things that you could learn. And the risk is it makes people feel like it's not that you're having a tough time, it's that you've got the wrong mindset, which is not necessarily the most helpful or constructive thing to hear. So, but it comes from Carol Dweck mainly, who's the researcher who pioneered a lot of this. And she talked about fixed mindset and growth mindset. And I think I will send you a tip sheet as well, which we've got on how to be resilient, Great. Which has got the summaries of this as well. But a lot of it is default responses to things. So it would be whether you feel that your skills are fixed, that success is scarce, that if someone else does well, that means there's less for you, or do you see your capacity to learn and to grow and think, if I don't have the resources, I could acquire them. If someone else is successful that I know, that means there's someone successful in my network who can help me. So it's a lot of it is to do with those default mode reactions of where do you go when something happens, what's your immediate thought to it. So most of the kind of things on growth mindset questionnaires are about, do you find challenge stressful or an opportunity to learn? Do you feel upset when you make mistakes, or do you see it as a chance to improve your skills because you won't make that mistake again? A lot of it ties into learning, whether you see the world as an opportunity to learn, whether you're experimenting and trying things out. And it's not necessarily that there is kind of people who have one or the other. I think of it more as just a set of behaviors that you might want to just try and nudge towards, of just thinking, what can I do to expand my skills? How can I see this as a chance to get better at things, rather than just feeling like you need to protect the scarce thing that we've got. But it's not like there's a kind of precise definitive thing of, if you think these ways you'll be fine, and if you think these ways you're bad. It's more, what do you find helpful in different situations? Yeah,
one of the things that I do with people when I run courses on business planning for people who hate business planning, and it's like a lot of it is about demystifying it. And one of the things that I get people to do right at the beginning is just to ask themselves a whole load of open questions. So using what, where, how, when, who, and why. And actually just sitting down for like even 5 or 10 minutes and just asking yourself a whole load of questions that start with those words can be, in my experience, can be really sort of not motivated, but can unlock a lot of positive thinking. How could this be an opportunity? What do I have to offer? How could I help people? Those are some of the things that I sat down and sort of asked myself, back in March. And I think that for me was definitely part of, I guess, our resilient response to this situation. So I think open questions can be really, really helpful. I've seen that work a lot.
Yeah, and I think that it's one question, I suppose, is about how much it is possible to plan at the moment, and whether it's a sort of it sets up a fixed position or a fixed mindset to have a plan and to think it needs to be enacted, whether that actually gets in the way. And so business planning during uncertainty is one of the things that we'll talk more about in the next session. But I once got into an argument on a panel about business planning at a social enterprise conference, and because I was sort of trying to put the idea that maybe business planning was a massive waste of time, and that its primary role was to make chief execs and boards feel better rather than actually help the business, because it's like, we've got a plan, we've put it in that drawer over there, we all feel certain about things now. And of course then the plan, you don't even, you look back on it a year later and go, did we do that? Oh no, we did something else because a funder asked us to do this instead, or we got that opportunity to work with these people. And so I think I've advocated a lot more about setting intentions and goals and directions. And so if you say what we want to do is expand our audience in this group, but we're not sure how we're going to do it, and here are some ideas of how we might, and this is what we're going to try, just holding the plans a little lighter can make it feel a bit less disastrous when they go wrong.
Yeah, I talk about inventing your future rather than business planning. I think we probably have a lot in common. I call it business guessing.
Business guessing, I really like. Yeah, that's much more honest.
Yeah. So we're coming up to the point where we're going to move into sort of Q&As. But so if anybody has got any questions that you want to ask us, then please do tell them. But it'd be really useful to just know what's sort of coming up in the session for you, what's making you think about, what you're taking from it, what's resonating with you. It's just really useful for us to know what's sort of landing and what's useful. But if you have got any questions, then please do stick those in the chat. I'm going to ask Abby to turn on her camera and unmute herself and let us know if there are any questions that we can cover. And also we'll try and come back into the chat and just share some of those things that you've been saying about tips that, things that you do to cope. Hi, Abby.
Sorry, no questions just yet. Just lots of really good comments and really good ideas. A couple I wanted to highlight. I think there was talk around, there were lots of really great ideas around practice that is going to help you feel better, but actually sometimes there can be a sense of guilt there because there's just so many other competing needs. When there's still that need to keep working and creating work, but actually justifying having that time, I suppose. So that was quite interesting. Some conversations around the kind of 5-5-5 strategy, and someone also made the comment around, I guess, the challenge now is with Corona, it could still matter in 5 months or 5 years, and that's why it can feel so overwhelming.
Yeah, and I think I saw that, and it's definitely there are different types of threat, different types of problems, and I think one of the things that we end up doing is sort of treating everything as if it's the same. But of course, if you've got a very short-term problem, you get stressed about it and then it passes off, that's less of a problem than if that stress is there for months or years. And so we're sort of partly in quite an unusual time with that. But the thing that did come to mind about it is that one of the things that we often end up doing in difficult situations is sort of it's almost self-blaming, or feeling like, if only I'd done something differently or done something better. And in some ways that can be an attempt to try and feel in control. And a more frightening thing, but also potentially one that opens up more possibilities, is to admit that actually maybe it wasn't our fault, and actually there are some things that are beyond us that are affecting us, and then just plan from there rather than trying to beat ourselves up about things that actually are just really big and difficult.
Yeah. That thing about kindness, I think, is really important, because if you think about the kind of mind that you need to, the mindset the kind of state of mind that you need to be in when you're trying to plan, you can't do that if you're stressed and and beating yourself up. So I think this idea of sort of self-kindness is really, really important in dealing with this. I remember talking at the way back in March, because it feels like such a long time ago, but reading, somebody said to me that they'd been sent a message from their employer that said, you're not working from home, you're at home trying to work during a global pandemic. And like the number of people that I've said that to, and you can just see like their faces light up, and they realize that they don't have to be as productive as they are normally, and it's all right for them to have a day where they can't get out of their pajamas. And just because we've been in this for a long time, and some people are going back to normal, that's still the case. So I think the kindness thing is so important, and I'm sort of saying that out loud so that I remember that for myself.
Yeah. There was also, I wanted to pick up on quickly on something that Dee put in the chat, which is accept a thought is just a thought.
Yeah.
And part of that kindness is about just allowing yourself to just observe what your mind is doing without necessarily trying to control it. To just go, oh, I seem to be having a lot of thoughts that everything is pointless today. That's interesting, Yeah. And there was a great line that I read on Twitter. I can't remember who said it, but it just said, don't believe everything you think. And it's just part of that holding things lightly, again, the plans, but also the kind of beliefs that you have about the world. It's all just stuff passing through your mind, and tomorrow you might feel differently, and that's okay. It's part of the interesting thing about being human.
Yeah. There was I went to a talk a little while ago, and somebody was talking about a scenario where if you imagined that you had, I think it was, the magic figure was 484,000. If you were given £484,000 every day, it was deposited into your bank first thing in the morning, and you had to spend it every day. She wanted you to think about what you would spend it, because if you didn't spend it, it would disappear. And so she got you thinking about that. And then she said, actually, the reason I'm asking you to do that is because that's the number of seconds that we have in every day. And once you've done that, once you've spent your 484,000 seconds, they've gone. And that was quite interesting in terms of like thinking, you pick up what are you going to focus on, which thoughts are you going to allow to, to kind of lodge into your brain. I thought that was quite an interesting way to think about it.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about productivity, we often talk about the scarce thing being time, and how you spend your time being the key thing.
Yeah.
But one of the things that can happen is that we start looking around at ways to become more efficient in the way that we use our time, and we get all this time back, but then we just add more things on. So you just end up, the productivity just becomes a fuel for being busier and busier, and it becomes a habit of like, what needs doing. And then when you actually want to come and stop, it's like, well, I'm not allowed to stop. There's things on my to-do list. Surely there must be. If not, I will invent some. And so actually having that freedom to be able to say, you know what, actually, I've got a limited amount of time, limited amount of energy, limited amount of attention. Where would I like to spend it each day? Is quite a nice way of approaching even quite difficult days.
Yeah. That's interesting. I have one last sort of acronym. I've been making a lot of these up because I'm trying really hard to sort of, cope with all the things that we're going through at the moment. So my final acronym that I'm going to offer people is REST. So it sort of links into resilience. So I spend hours trying to figure these, make them, turn them into words. But so REST is about, I decided was about reflecting, experimenting, sort of that idea of self-checking, and then the idea of my tribe, because we talked about, resources not just being internally, but if you can reflect on what's going on and then think, okay, and choose to be curious about it rather than sort of fearful. And, I was talking about that last time around the difference, the idea that curiosity and fear can be different sides of the same coin. And then this idea of like self-checking, just checking, what am I thinking? A bit like Dee was saying, what's going on here? I'm just thinking these things. And then just, I have a number of people that are kind of like on speed dial for if I'm having a moment, who I would just, call them up and ask them for the opposite of sort of validation, ask them to sort of just go, Julie, you're having a moment. And that can be really, really useful as a sort of sounding board, really.
Yeah, definitely. And I'd love to hear more on the chat of people's ways of coping, things that you figured out, because I think we all kind of develop these little tricks, these ways of coping with it, because partly this is a big scary difficult situation, but it's not like it's the first time we face challenges. That's the type of industries that we're in, that there'll be little things that you remember, but you forget them when things get really difficult and stop doing half of them, and it's quite good just to remember them all. I can see a few more questions coming in, so I'll shut up.
Yeah.
Would you like me to read them out?
Sure.
So one question is, do you have any coping strategies for the sense of envy or being left behind that's starting to happen for some people in our industries?
Yeah, my immediate thought was to ask yourself, do you want their job? And if you don't, then there's no reason to be envious. So, I mean, I think you may well find people who think, you think, well, they've been able to go back to doing what they love, and that's amazing. But a lot of the time, it's that people are going into jobs that you wouldn't necessarily want to do yourself. So part of it's that. But I also think that it's that growth mindset thing. One of the questions is, when you see other people being successful, do you feel that makes your success less likely? Because they've got it. That's that feeling of a zero sum about success. Whereas actually being near or connected to people who are successful makes your chances of being successful higher. And it's a bit like with the problem with job centres, is that job centres connect people who don't have jobs to other people who also don't have jobs, and no one has a job. Whereas what you need is to connect people who don't have jobs to people who are doing really well and have spare capacity and want to hire people. And those are the connections. So when you see other people being successful, that means there's more people who might buy tickets to an online concert. It means there's more people who might want to buy a class, or, that's what we've got to think of, is that we're all in it together.
Yeah. There's a comment here from, let me just see who it is. Let me just see, sorry. I think it was Catherine. Yeah, Catherine was talking about the sort of, trying to get her head around the idea that she might get a call tomorrow and have loads of work, or she might be without work for months on end. So she's sort of struggling to enjoy the time because of all of that, and she keeps adding things onto her to-do list and keeping busy when even though there's nothing happening. And I was talking to somebody about that the other day she was talking about the sort of endless churn of applying for job after job after job and then not getting them. And we had quite an interesting chat about she's also doing sort of track and trace. She's one of these, she's found some work doing sort of track and tracing, and we were talking about trying to use this time to think about what's really, really important to her, so that she knows then when she goes back to that list of jobs that she's got to do, or the list of jobs that she's got to apply for, whether they really are what she wants to do. And that idea, if you've got enough money for now, then actually what's the best use of your time? Is it to kind of make a list to distract you, or is it to really do some of that work that you don't normally have time to do?
Yeah, and I suppose one of the things I found just from running Mindapples is there wasn't a linear connection between the work I put into winning business and the actual business. And that actually I could, when we hired people to do lead generation or focus really hard on getting new clients, we didn't really get any more new clients. And actually then we'd suddenly get rung up by somebody going, we met at an event 2 years ago and I've moved to a new company and I'd love to get you in. And suddenly we have loads of work. So trying to seek business in a non-linear environment, it can be a bit maddening, but it's quite helpful, I think, to just acknowledge that actually a lot of the time, the way that you get work is just by building the kind of weak links in your network and by talking about things that you're passionate about and by just trying to engage in things that you think are important, and not necessarily I'm going to sit here with my list of phone numbers and I'm going to call people up until I have a job, because it may not be that that's the way that the sector works or the way that the environment works.
Yeah. There's a comment here from Adele, which is quite interesting, Andy, about, she's the thing about you're not having a hard time, you've got the wrong mindset. And she's saying that it makes whatever you're experiencing worse because you haven't been heard, and it feels like your emotions have been shoved back down inside you. And she's asking, how would you deal with a conversation like that?
Yes, yeah, I saw that, and disembowel them with maximum blood, I suppose. I don't know, maybe not. It's a real problem, I think, in particularly in work, where it's almost a sort of tendency for, I think, a lot of employers to think that they don't have to take the pressure off their people. They need to engineer them to become more resilient, and then they can continue to cut budgets and ask them to do more with less. And there is an increasing pushback on it. I think the key things, just from in terms of what the research is saying, the first is that personality traits are not something that you can just decide to have a different personality. So it does affect everyone differently. And it's not that there are some people who are really resilient and other people who aren't. It's that they're affected by different things. So some people might just be really affected by not having any work colleagues around them and find being alone really difficult. But those people wouldn't have shown up as people who are very sensitive before, because the environment that they were in brought the best out of them and they found it really fun and they were the life and soul of the office. And so a lot of the time it's about just saying, it's not that you've got the wrong mindset, it's that this situation particularly presses your buttons. You find this particularly difficult and other people may not, but that doesn't matter. Everyone's got their different trigger points. But
yeah, is that one of those situations where it's, you can't control that person, what they're saying, but you can control your reaction to it? Is it one of those situations just where you remind yourself that it's fine for you to be fit, and your reality is that you are finding this really difficult, and that those sorts of things?
Yeah, I suppose that, I think what people are often trying to nudge at with the mindset stuff is it's almost trying to, I think that to take it in a positive way, if we can, it's about trying to identify the bits which are actually you having a difficult time versus the bits where you're making your situation feel worse or be worse. So it's trying to identify which bits you can control or take any responsibility for. And as long as you feel confident that you're doing those things, then people are wrong to say that it's in any way your fault to feel bad, so, but it doesn't mean that you're going to solve the whole problem by changing your mindset. It just means that you can avoid adding to it or making it worse, but it still may well be a difficult situation. It's not like we have the power to suddenly reverse difficulties or remove threats. It's just about trying to do whatever we can to make sure that our little bit of it, our contribution to that, is a constructive one.
Yeah. There's a speaker called Charlie Hogg. I don't know if you know him, Andy. He has a link to the Inner Space building in Covent Garden. He's Australian. I heard him talk a few weeks ago, and he was talking about this idea of like change and crisis, and then chaos ensuing, and then eventually, there's kind of like some kind of things reform. And he was saying that in a crisis, the only thing that he thinks really works is this idea of like self-leadership, self-awareness, and and then sort of self-empowerment, where you work out what gives you the energy. So I guess that picks up on that a little bit, this idea that, of just really protecting yourself and thinking about yourself and getting to know yourself a bit better, like you were saying at the beginning.
Yeah, and I suppose the better we get at noticing what will push our buttons, what situations we find difficult, the more targeted our responses can be. And I think one of the things I've been noticing a lot with people, including myself, is at the moment it's quite hard to tell exactly which things are making us feel anxious or flat, because there's so many different things. And so just starting to understand, for me, one thing is that I realized that one of the ways I was managing my mind is that when I would go out to visit clients and see people and do group sessions, I picked up a lot of energy from those people. And that meant I didn't need to find as much energy in myself. Whereas if I'm doing webinars, I need to find a lot more of that within myself. So I need to do more to try and find that energy elsewhere, do things that kind of keep me perky and upbeat. And so some of it's just about trying to get the clarity to be able to identify, well, that bit, that's what I'm struggling with, whether it's worrying that you're not going to be able to do something that you enjoy for work, or whether it's worrying that, you're going to end up, having to let down someone else, or what is the thing that's pressing your buttons. The more you can get that clarity, the easier it is to at least to look at what you might be able to do in response, even if it's not immediately evident.
Because anxiety is like trying to swat flies, isn't it? There's just so much, it's almost like contagion of like worry in your brain. I could talk about this for hours, but I'm really conscious that it's 11:10, and we'll get in trouble if we don't move things on. So I'm going to sort of move us sort of onto the kind of the final bit of today, really, which is to love to get your thoughts. One last interaction from you guys, which is to get you to think about, we want to end on a positive. We've got a little bit sort of, intense there, but what are the kind of like one or two things that you think you might be able to commit to today that is to help you, deal with uncertainty or to deal with stress? What do you think those things might be? And again, it would be really lovely if you could share those in the chat, because what we can do is we can kind of crowdsource almost like a not quite a manifesto, but this amazing resource that other people could then go to if they find themselves. So if you could just have a little think for maybe a minute or two and just think about what's the one or two things that you're going to commit to having a go at doing off the back of today, that would be brilliant. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to thanks, Abby, that was great. Thank you for helping us with the questions. While you're doing that, I just want to talk a little bit about the sort of follow-up resources that we're going to be getting out in the next few days. So what we'll do is we'll share a recording in this. So I can see in the chat that some people are saying, oh, we've covered loads of ground, and they want to kind of rewind and recap. So you can absolutely do that. So we'll share the video. And what we'll also do is I'll pull together everything that's in the chat and create a sort of series of sort of tip sheets and things like that, and follow-up resources, and any books that people have recommended. I can see a few of those in there. I would add Busier by Tony Crabb to the book list that's going. That's a really good book for sort of dealing with sort of overwhelm. So I'll add that one in there. So we'll be sharing that. We'll share all of the tips. I know that Andy's got a couple of Mindapples tip sheets that we can share as well as that. But what we'll also do is we'll be sharing Sarah's illustration. So Sarah, I don't know if you could share your screen for us with us, and we could just take a little bit of a look at your picture and just see how you've drawn what we've been talking about.
Bear with me a sec.
Brilliant. Should have given you a little bit of a warning, and we'll come back and we'll share some of these inspirations in a minute. While Sarah's sharing her screen, oh, here it comes. Have a look. Very interested to see this. I'm in awe of how much Sarah manages to do. Wow, look at that.
A couple of the acronyms I didn't quite get the end of because you said them so quickly. I was trying, but I'll catch up with you at the end, and we'll just. I think perfect. The S off, not the last S off, but I'll sort that out.
Brilliant. Oh, that's great. Thank you, Sarah. So Sarah will put a few finishing touches to that, and we'll share that as well. Thanks, Sarah. That's great. Thank you. And one of the things that when we put this series together, one of the things that we were aiming to do was to provide points of connection for people who maybe are working on their own, don't have that kind of natural network that comes from being in a quote sort of normal job. And so what we're doing, as well as these sort of bigger talks, is we're doing sort of follow-up drop-in sessions. We normally do them a week after this, but I'm actually away next week, so we're going to be doing it in 2 weeks. The next one will be in 2 weeks' time, which is the 5th of August. And they're really different sessions. Last time we had about 15 or 16 people there, I think. And there's no agenda, there's no other conversation that happens, there's nothing scheduled. It's just the conversation that the people that come along want to have. So we might well pick up on some of the topics that came up today, or people might want to share some other things that are going on, or you might just want to, you know, hang out with a bunch of people who are interested in similar sorts of conversations, a similar interest in sort of putting their mental health first. And whoever comes, you know, they're the right people. It's that the idea that there's no right conversation. We're just interested in bringing people together and helping out a bit. I have 2 people who are going to be helping. We give Andy Gibson a day off for this one, but I have another Andy in my arsenal of Andys. So could I ask Andy and Ella to just switch on their cameras and give people a wave? So there's Ella. Ella is a really good friend of mine, and she'll be helping out. She's training at the moment, partway through her training to become a therapist. And Andy, their second Andy, is a trained mental health nurse and also runs a record label, as you'll be able to tell from all the magnificent shelves of vinyl there. So he seems perfect for the job of kind of, you know, a wingman for this conversation. So Andy, Ella and I will be back on the 5th of August, and we'll send you a link to that session. So if you want to pick up on any of the stuff that's happened today, you'd be very welcome to join us there. It's very informal, tea and biscuits mandatory, that sort of thing. Should we just take a quick look at some of those interactions? And have you seen a few of those, a couple of those sort of commitments that people are making? It'd be really interesting to see some of those. Going for a run.
Taking really more time to enjoy my curiosity. I like that one.
That's lovely. That's really nice.
Yeah, clarifying what you're worrying about.
Yeah, that's a really nice one. I'm intrigued. I need to catch up on the debate that's been going on about tree bathing. And I need to look in the chat and take a look at that. The next session that we're doing, we've got 2 more to go. The next one is on the 19th of August, a little shout out for that. And that's going to be about sorting the shoulds from the coulds, and finding the right path. So it's going to be a little bit it's going to move us on from this one. We're talking about things like how you make good decisions, how you stay motivated, productivity, those sorts of things. Anything else, Andy, you want to sort of say briefly about that, or have I covered the main?
No, I think a lot of it, I suppose, trying to help explore what's the positive side of all this. If we talk today about the threats, then what are the opportunities? What do you want to be doing, and what can we set some goals and intentions around? Given that we first need to manage our minds enough to be able to think clearly about it, but hopefully we can talk a bit about what we want.
Yeah, exactly, and the strategies for getting that. So that's what we'll be doing on the 19th of August. If you just in terms of follow-up, if you want to stay in touch with what Andy and I are doing, then please do follow us on social media. Andy is at Mindapples, and
at Gandy, Gandy, Gandy like candy, but also at Mindapples as well.
Mindapples. And I'm at Curious Julia P, and the hub is Tweets at the Hub. If you have enjoyed today and you're able to help share the on-demand version of that would be brilliant. We're using a hashtag, it's hashtag Hub Balance for this talk, if you want to do that. And please do tell people about this. We want these sessions to be as useful to as many people as possible. So a few quick thank yous. Thank you to you, Andy, again, for being brilliant. It's always a joy to have a conversation with you. Thanks to Sarah for doing that, and Abby for looking after the chat, and Matt for keeping us going, and Ella and Andy, thanks in advance for next week. Last time when we said goodbye, I got people to do a Mindapple. So we had a whole screen of people doing this. This time I was thinking about what we could do, because I've decided this should be a thing, Andy, just so you know. I might get you to invent the next one.
Is this the cameras on moment?
This is the cameras on moment, people. Good reminder. So if you could turn your cameras back on, and go into gallery view. Last time we did Mindapples. This time I was thinking about this idea of like self-awareness and self-leadership, and I was thinking that really, during a period of uncertainty, is our superpower. So what I would like people to do just before we do a sort of wave is to do a pose on camera of what represents your superpower. So mine might be, I don't know, it might be something like that, or, you know, but what says superpower to you? There you go. So mine would be that. There's a few, like when we did this before with somebody in real life, they lifted their child aloft and kind of did that. So a lovely sort of superpower moment would be brilliant. Before, this is where it all goes wrong, because then we can't wave, and we need to do a wave as well. But so superpower pose and then a wave, that would be great. Thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.